Authentication can be set two ways. You have the Enable AP Local Authentication checkbox, and we'll come back on that in a minute. But there's also the AAA authentication. So if I go back to my SSID, test one, and if I go to advanced, you see that I've using here a local authentication, which means that whatever is defined at the FlexGroup level is going to be applied for that SSID. So if I go back to my group and go to the General tab, one thing I can do is call a Radius server directly from the FlexGroup. So you see here what I'm going to do is to define an IP address for a server, and I'm going to use that server as my Radius for clients authenticating through the SSIDs on the APs depending on that group. So it's the same creation as usual, right? You create a server, port, etc. And you can create two, one primary and one secondary. You cannot create 17 like on the main controller interface because it's a smaller set. Okay, that's one thing. Of course, if you do so, that means that you'll need to configure your Radius server to receive queries from access points belonging to that Flex group. So as usual, every time you do that, one thing you want to make sure that you do is that your access points are created as clients on the Radius server. And the consequence of that is that you have to make sure that your access points have a static IP address. So if I click my access point here, you see IP address is VLAN 23, but it's dynamically assigned, it's DHCP. So as I'm going to configure my Radius to allow this client to query it, I need to switch this to static IP address. And then I can go to my Radius and add a new client, and I will do that for all the access points in the Flex group and enter the IP address of the access points in that group, so they have the right, each of them, to query the Radius server for client authentication. If you skip that step, of course, it's not going to work, so don't forget. My access point has a static IP address, my Radius is configured, now my Radius group is going to work for these access points. The other option I can set is Enable AP Local Authentication. If I do this, then I may not be using the Radius server, but I will be going to the second tab, Local Authentication, where I'm going to actually use the access point as the Radius server. So let me check this and go to the next tab and see, here I have two tabs, one which allows me to create some local users, so I can enter a certain number of users on my access points. Okay, it's going to be on the Flex group, right? So all the APs in that group will get those users, and you can create, a couple of those. Or you can also upload a CSV file to push, the list of users to all the access points in the group. And then there is this protocol tab where you're going to, just like on the other systems, decide what kind of authentication mechanism you allow. By default, we allow LEAP, IPFAST, PEEP, and TLS. By the way, if you configure this and if you use any certificate-based type of authentication like TLS or PEEP, be sure to read Cisco documentation. This is beyond the CCNA level, but be sure to read the documentation because that means you need to push a certificate on the access points because they will be the authentication server. So you need to have a certificate exchange between the authentication server, the AP, and the client. And you have to know how to push that certificate, where you get it from, how you push it to the controller. So there is some subtleties you need to be aware of those. If you go to CCNP, you'll work on that. But at CCNA level, you don't need to care too much about it. But in real life, if you configure this, be sure to check the configuration. Now you may be completely confused because we have this local authentication on the Advanced tab of the SSID. Then we have the Radius defined at the Flex group level. And then you can also check the local AP authentication at the Flex group level. So how does that combine? What is the rule depending on where? And yes, it's complicated. So this is at the edge of what you need to know. So if you just want to take the exam, you can safely stop there. But if you want to configure that thing and if you want it to work, maybe you want to stay a bit longer. So this is how it works. You have it in this table for your memory. Suppose that in the SSID, you did not check local authentication on the access point. If you didn't do that, it means that you're using central authentication. So what happens? If you use central authentication, you're going to use central authentication as your primary method always. That means that if the controller is reachable, and if you are in touch with that controller with this local auth check unchecked in the SSID, the controller is going to be your prime authentication point. You're going to use it always. If you haven't checked this local auth in the SSID Advanced tab, you may have configured AP local authentication feature and usernames on the Flex group. You're not going to use that. However, if you've configured at the Flex group level a Radius server, that could be used as a backup. So in other words, you're going to use always the controller as a primary method. And if you ever lose connectivity to the controller and you get in disconnected mode, in standalone mode, then you're going to look at the Radius configuration at the FlexConnect group level and use that Radius as a backup mechanism. But you're not going to use a local AP configuration on the FlexConnect group. Now, if you used the local auth checked and you say, I want to delegate authentication locally to the Flex group, well, then it depends on how you configure the Flex group. If you didn't configure any local AP authentication, then you have to have a Radius defined at the FlexConnect group level because that will be your primary method. So if you send things to the access point, if you have Radius defined, you're going to use that Radius. But if you also configured the local AP authentication, then you don't care about the Radius because you said specifically that the local AP had to be used for authentication. So let me go back to my screen and show you again. So here, because I checked local auth, I want to have authentication done on the FlexConnect group. But if I uncheck this and then go back to my Flex group, then here my local authentication, my AP local authentication is not going to be used because I'm using the controller primarily. But if I cannot reach my controller, my AAA defined here is going to be my backup. So AP local authentication is unused because it's unchecked on the SSID, but Radius defined here is my backup. Now if I go back to my SSID, go back to the Advanced tab and check local authentication here, then I'm not using the central controller configuration anymore. And here, it depends on what configuration I have. If I have AP local authentication, I'm going to use it. And this is not going to be used. But if I don't have AP local authentication, then my prime usage is going to be the AAA Radius servers defined here. You see how that is combined? So it's a little bit complicated, so you may have to look at the table a few times to make sure you get it right, because you need to know where your authentication is going to go. But again, this is a little bit beyond what you need to know for the CCNA exam, but it's useful if you want to configure this, because those options are going to interact, so you need to know where your users are going to be identified and authenticated.